And good morning, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives 2. And of course, it's morning here on the East Coast of the United States, but it's the afternoon over in Europe where they are 4 or 5 hours ahead of me. I never can tell which. Um, but over there in the afternoon, joining us today, and we're very, very honored to have him with us, is Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche organization. Good morning, Harley. How are you today?
Hi, John. We're actually 6 hours ahead of you.
Whoa, 6 hours. Okay. Well, the internet has been very good to us then by skipping through all of those time zones and letting us communicate. It really is kind of amazing. But here we are, and it's just terrific to have this technology. I'm not complaining about everything about modern life. Don't get me wrong, but it's just the people in charge. We need new management. Would you not agree?
Well, I think technology is great. And, I remember as a kid wondering if they would ever get telephones where you could see who you were talking to. Now, my children just take for granted you pick up a cell phone and you can see your grandmother just by pushing a button. So there are a lot of things that are improved, but I agree with you completely. The people who are controlling it are using it to control us.
Yes. And that sense of control is very, very creepy. And I'll start by saying I am appalled at the idea of a lockdown in Austria for anybody that just for their own personal reasons, for religious or medical or for whatever reason, does not want to have a particular medication injected against their will. And this is just chilling and foreboding, and it's not just me, it's about the whole world. Are we all going to have to submit to the totalitarian demands of a government that we actually submit our bodies to their treatment without any recourse? I'm very much concerned about it.
Well, my wife's family is from Austria, and they're split on this because the younger members of the family are with you. They're saying this is wrong. But the older members of the family are a little concerned. One of the neighbors had a child or a younger person in the family who caught COVID and brought it home, and the grandfather died from it. So there's a split. It's somewhat of a generational split, I think, in terms of Austria.
That makes sense. Andy's just put on the board here American labor unions sue Biden administration to expand COVID vaccine mandates and cover smaller businesses. That's the AFL-CIO, I guess, working with the pro vaccine folks. Interesting comment, but I don't suppose that's hit your radar screen at this point.
Well, no, I follow all of these things, as you know, and I think we're in some really dangerous times, and it's not just I know people are very emotional about the masks and vaccines and things of that sort, but we just had this meeting yesterday, telephonic meeting between Xi Jinping and Biden, and while it was good that it happened and that they're talking, what came out of it just shows you the problems that we have. They could have discussed what China and the U.S. could do together. And one of the first things would be, why not work together to stop the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan? Biden brings up the so-called humanitarian crisis with the Uyghurs in China. If he's so concerned about humanitarian crises, how about the fact that 9 million people in Afghanistan are facing starvation within the next couple of weeks? And meanwhile, the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve are holding on to over $9 billion of money that's owed to the Afghan central bank. So, you see these kinds of crises. We also have, this whole question of the refugee crisis between Belarus and Poland. It's another thing I'm watching very closely. Putin and Merkel had a discussion about it, I think, this morning. But here's the interesting thing to me. While they're blaming Belarus and Russia for this crisis, Putin raised the issue. What about the fact that most of these refugees are fleeing from wars that were carried out by the NATO and US military, and the sanction policies that are making these countries unlivable? The cause of the humanitarian crises is the war policy and the sanctions policy. And the fact that there are refugees is not surprising. People are trying to stay alive. And right now we're seeing, what is it, 1,000 people at the border a day are showing up. There are tens of millions of possible refugees from North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa that are prepared to come over to Europe. So, there's just a proliferation of crises. And while it's good that Biden and Xi Jinping had a chance to talk, it appears as though much of what they were saying went past each other.
Yeah, a lot of stuff in there. Let's go back to the issue of the $9 billion for a minute. $9 billion is a whole lot of money to anybody except for the United States.
That's right.
The United States says $9 billion, throws it away any day. Anybody wants $9 billion, you can have it. Because as long as you know Joe Biden, or if you know Mitch McConnell, or if you know the right person, you're going to get your $9 billion. It's not a big problem. You just got to do what you got to do to get it. Now, the way that they do it is the quantitative easing, right? Is they say, well, we need this money and it doesn't exist, so we'll just make it. We'll just create it, and that is the driver of inflation and other horrible things that happen. So,
well, and that's an important point, because if you listen to the talking heads on the media, and if you listen to the officials in the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, their new line is that the COVID pandemic is what caused inflation. Now, before anyone was diagnosed with COVID, the policy that created this inflation was in place. And that was back in September 2019, when they increased dramatically the amount of overnight funds available through the repurchasing agreements. September 2019, when it looked as though there could have been a very big derivatives loss or corporate defaults, the JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, and others went to the Fed and said, we need more cash. And so one night it was 20 billion, the next night 30 billion. This is not just 9 billion, this is 20, 30, 50 billion. Mm-hmm. Now quantitative easing continues at about a rate of 120 billion new dollars produced each month. For what? Is it going into investment in new technologies? Is it going into desperate store owners who need a cash infusion to stay in business? Is it going into new plant and equipment, job training? No, it's going into the hands of speculators who are doing great because they're buying and selling each other's worthless assets. And the trading companies make money every time they sell something, whether it goes up or down, they make money. So on paper, they say, oh, the economy is growing dramatically. And they say, well, and because it's growing, we have as a side effect inflation. No, we have inflation because we're producing huge volumes of money that are going into nothing physical, nothing productive. They're going into, in many cases, cokeheads who are involved in trading at split-second rates, buying and selling assets that no one's ever heard of. So this is the problem with the economy. And, I think when you talk about $9 billion being available, that's money that was the money for the old Afghan government. And what the Treasury and Federal Reserve are saying is that, well, we don't want to give it to the Taliban because they might use it for terrorism. Now, here's the interesting thing. We just left $80 billion or so worth of military equipment for them. If they wanted to, they could start selling that off to terrorist groups. If they want to, if they're desperate for money, they can start ramping up opium production again or offer terrorists safe haven. So if we want to stabilize Afghanistan, give them their own money back, and then figure out a way to offer humanitarian aid. I mean, the head of the World Food Program, David Beasley, called on the billionaires to put in a few $100 million each. You have someone like Elon Musk sitting on a net account of $300 billion. Bezos, almost $200 billion. How would it hurt them to put $1 or $2 billion into these countries as humanitarian aid? Instead, they use it for their special projects, whether it's their own space program or, monogrammed toilet paper. You have an absolute sign of lack of empathy for people who are facing horrible circumstances. And so, it's left to governments to do something. And you look at our government now with the debt, with the overall problems of spending, with the inability to get an agreement on anything in the Congress. And it basically means Afghan children are going to be dying when they could be saved. And so people who are weeping crocodile tears about the status of Afghan women, why don't they get in and fight for the release of those funds to make it better for the better conditions, circumstances for the women of Afghanistan?
That's a fabulous point. All those pussy hats, and what are they there for, really? That's what I think that's a fantastic point. Is that all of these people that are still concerned about whether Orange Man is going to trample on their rights, can just take an example of what's happening to the women in Afghanistan, and not use it as a political bludgeon, but instead use it as an opportunity to go in there and say, hey, we're going to fix this. I mean, how many, if you had 10 million women with pussy hats, putting in some money and some work and, actually doing things, maybe they could actually make a difference. I'm sorry, I get a little angry sometimes at the hypocrisy that people
That's
fall
it, John.
into.
It is aggravating. The hypocrisy is so absurd. Here you have the European Union leaders ranting and raving about Belarus and Lukashenko, the dictator, and they say he won't talk to us. Well, they won't talk to him because they've put sanctions on the country and they're trying to overthrow him. And Putin said to Merkel, why don't you talk to Lukashenko? And she said, well, we can't talk to him. And Putin said, why? And she said, well, it's a problem. Now, the problem is with the transatlantic leadership. Now, here's another example. The great military power, the United Kingdom, said they're concerned that Russia is about to overrun Ukraine. Now, there's disputes over whether there are a few thousand troops on the border, whether there are 90,000 troops massed to overrun Ukraine. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry last Thursday denied that there were any Russian troops on the border. And then the U.S. Defense Secretary Austin went there, and the next day they said, oh, yeah, we just discovered 90,000 Russian troops. So they're talking about the fact that Putin is prepared to overrun Ukraine at any moment. So what do the British do? They announced they're going to send 600 troops to Ukraine to stop the Russian invasion, to deter the Russian invasion. I hate to say this, but I don't think 600 British troops are going to deter the Russians if they really wanted to invade. But there's no indication that why would Putin do that? What would he gain from it? The Lithuanians are saying the same thing. They think the Russians are going to hit Ukraine, then hit Lithuania. Russia used to have those countries, and that's why the empire fell apart in part. So, these narratives are used to create the impetus to spend $1 trillion a year on defense. Now, here's the one that kills me. The Daily Mail, one of the tabloids in London, had a special interview today with none other than Russia expert Christopher Steele of the infamous Steele Report, who said that Putin thinks the West is at war with Russia. That's why he's so dangerous. Now, given what we know about Christopher Steele, who could take seriously a newspaper that would quote him as an expert about what's about to happen in a region? So, the hypocrisy that you pointed out, that's the biggest problem in terms of the narratives being cranked out from the West. And the second biggest problem is too many people either believe them or ignore them and just say, well, that's just more of the same. It doesn't mean anything to me. But it does mean something to you. It's your life. Doesn't it matter to you if $1 trillion goes into the defense budget to stir up wars that are killing people and developing weapon systems that we'll never use, instead of spending money on education, on healthcare, on roads and bridges? That's the tragic irony of the situation. So it's hypocrisy, but ultimately it's an irony of a Shakespearean quality where the whole civilization seems to be going a little bit crazy.
Yeah. Well, my original question was going to, and those are all great points, and there's so much I want to develop from that. But let me go back first to the one that I can remember first, and that was this: why doesn't China or Russia, for that matter, take a similar stance to the United States and saying, "Oh, well, geez, we need $9 billion so that we can come in and help the Afghan people. And it's a wonderful investment because if we do that, then they'll love us and they'll let us come in and build the Belt and Road." Why is it not makes as much sense for Russia or China to come up with the $9 billion and just spend it and say and throw that into their own, what do you call it? Easing their own, a little bit of inflation. Just toss a little inflation in there so you can help, all these people through the winter. Why wouldn't China
Well,
do that? Why wouldn't Russia do that? Why are they all looking to the United States to cough up this money that is being sequestered for whatever reason?
well, there are two things there. First of all, the money the U.S. is holding is actually money the U.S. is holding on behalf of the Afghan government. So the Russians and Chinese don't have money from the Afghan government.
Right.
However, the Russians are sending supplies. They are spending money to help the people of Afghanistan. The Chinese now are also doing that. The Chinese and the Russians and the US and Pakistan met in Islamabad last week, something called the extended troika. So it's the US, China, and Russia plus Pakistan. And the Chinese, the Russians, and the Pakistanis asked the US to release that money as a first step and then put money into a humanitarian fund. The US said it would only give money for humanitarian aid that would not go through any government channels. Well, how do you get money to a country like Afghanistan without government channels? Some are even saying, let's drop it from helicopters. And that's how crazy the US position is. The military has actually drafted a plan to figure out how to go into remote villages and dump dollars out of helicopters. If the people picked the dollars off the mountaintops, they'd have nowhere to spend it because no one takes dollars in some of these areas. So the Russians, the Chinese, and the Pakistanis came in with a proposal. Now, the positive side is that Thomas West, who replaced Khalilzad as the representative for the U.S. interest in Afghanistan, went to Moscow after the meeting to talk further with the Russians about what could be done. This is a no-brainer. We have a lot of ill will towards us around the world because of what we've done with all these wars over the last 20 to 40 years. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, most countries think it was overdue. Many of them agree that it was done in a bad way, but they're wondering now, what will the U.S. do now that it's left Afghanistan? Because we're not going to leave them alone. We're talking about using over-the-horizon drone attacks into Afghanistan. So we're still involved in things there. So the Chinese have made a specific proposal, what's called the Pakistan corridor, the China-Pakistan corridor that would go through Afghanistan. And they're willing to put an investment into that. They're not even asking the United States to contribute to that, but they're asking that we provide a certain amount of humanitarian aid. So there are many ways you can do things. The Schiller Institute founder, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, proposed that we do something called Operation Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina is a famous Islamic Renaissance scholar, a Platonist, a doctor, who actually was born and lived for a period of his life in Afghanistan. And he's still very famous there as a doctor who developed certain modern medical technologies in the 12th century. We've proposed that countries get together on a project Ibn Sina to build up some medical capabilities in Afghanistan, because without money, they can't even afford any form of medicine. This is what happened to Iraq when the 1995 to 97 sanctions were imposed on them and 500,000 children died. So what would make more sense than the US, China, and Russia, maybe India as well, although India and Pakistan have problems together? What if they got together and said, okay, forget the money. Look, we just spent $3 to $7 trillion on a war. Let's spend a small portion of that to match the money that we owe Afghanistan to start some real projects going. That's what we are proposing. And there's support for it. I was just on a Pakistani television station this afternoon to discuss this, and it was very responsive, very good response from people who are Pakistan military who were on the program with me. So there are avenues, there are pathways. The problem is that if you have war hawks from both parties controlling the initiatives from the United States, and then you have Biden, who at best is very weak, and in many cases his administration is totally controlled by the same deep state that was involved in the regime change coup against Donald Trump. It's not going to work unless there's a outpouring of support from the American people, and so far there's not.
Another word that you used earlier in your answer was cokeheads, and I think that's a very important point. A very important point. First of all, in my own experience, I went to college. I was in the early '70s, graduated in '74. It was marijuana was what the drug of choice was, of course. But in the last year or so, there started to be cocaine that came around, and it was expensive, and I couldn't afford it. I didn't want to try it, but even if I wanted to, I couldn't have afforded it. It was like maybe $10 just to to get enough to get off a little bit, and I didn't $10 was a lot of money in 1973. So I never did it. When I got out of college, I tried it once or twice because of a friend of a friend said, so I did. I don't think anything happened, but here's what happens to my friends. My friends turned into assholes. It's like you put this powder in you, and it turns you into an asshole. I mean, and that was my word at the time. But what I think the real fact is that it takes away your empathy. It's my observation that people that use cocaine have lost their sense of empathy toward other people, and I think that goes on in these trading houses. I think that it helps them to do what they do, because how can you do this if you're sober and aware of yourself as a spiritual being, among other spiritual beings, people that are not just here to live and die and work there 40 hours a week, people who are here as part of a greater thing called life. And this drug and other drugs, but I'm glad to mention cocaine, because look what the Nazis did in South America when they went down there. Was they created this, and this is based on my research, and you may be aware of it, but a lot like Klaus Barbie, these people that escaped on the rat lines. Well, what did they do for a living? They went into the business.
John, you extend that into the 80s with the Iran-Contra operation, where we were actually bringing plane loads of cocaine on covert CIA flights. And in fact, the reason cocaine became cheap enough for people to use is they figured out how to turn it into crack and dumped it into the ghettos. And there's a reporter from the San Jose Mercury News, I have his book here, I can't remember his name for the moment, who wrote about this, and he was excoriated. He was driven to suicide or probably murdered.
Yeah, that's Webb.
Gary Marshall? No, Gary something.
Gary Webb.
What? Well, yeah. And what he showed, and I was in Los Angeles at the time, and we had town meetings where parents from the Black community were saying, where is all this crack coming from? And he had done an investigation that showed that it was coming through the United States. Some people say through Mena, Arkansas, and there were other places as well from the southern border, but it was being shipped into Los Angeles, turned into crack, and sold in the ghetto where people could afford it, and where you created a whole generation of crackheads. Now, the importance of this, and you're getting at something really important here, there's a new push from what we call Dope Incorporated. We wrote a book in the late 70s called Dope Incorporated, and it covered two aspects of drug trade that really go back to the opium wars against China. One is that it produces money, and the money ends up getting laundered through major financial institutions. And in fact, in the 80s, it was a major source of liquidity in the world financial system through the Credit Suisse, through the bank for what was there was a famous
BCCI.
bank, BCCI, yeah.
Yeah.
All of these were part of a network, but
James
the real
Comey.
key one, well, yeah, and then Hong Kong, Shanghai, HSBC, which still gets fined every couple of years for large scale drug money laundering. So, on the one side, you have a financial side, and it went into arms and terrorism and all sorts of other things. The BCCI case shows that. But what's the other side? You destroy the population. I was there just a little bit earlier than you when I was in college when marijuana first started coming in. And I watched people who were very serious students suddenly become more concerned with their own highs and their own orgasms and their own pleasure than with actually learning. And marijuana is again, it's much more potent today than it was then. It's all over. There's decriminalization or legalization going on. They're going to legalize cocaine and heroin sometime soon. And the argument that this is going to take the money away from the black market is a fraud, because the black market is bigger than ever. And all these mom and pop marijuana dispensaries that were set up in California, most of them soared in their stock value at the beginning, and now they're all collapsing. So this is part of a drug war. And as you know, this goes back to people like the Huxleys, Aleister Crowley, to really bad people who argued that we have to create an alternative reality. And they were also the same people who worked with DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project, to develop the internet. And so you see this conjuncture or connection between people who had very bad intentions. But what do they argue? We're freeing people. We're giving them more freedom. And there's a difference between freedom and license. And what we've seen with the rock, sex, drug counterculture is the creation of, as you say, unempathetic people who are more interested in their own pleasure, who are immune to the effects of seeing people dying on the streets, people who are homeless, people who have nothing, or people who are being deliberately starved in places like Yemen and Syria and Afghanistan. It doesn't register. And I think this is why whenever we have a Schiller Institute conference, and we just had one last weekend, the last panel is always a panel on culture and why we have to get back to a culture which has an exaltation of the image of man as in the image and likeness of the Creator, as opposed to a self-seeking, pleasure-seeking being. As the sort that Thomas Hobbes describes in the Leviathan, or the idea of the survival of the fittest in the Darwinian jungle. No, man was, as Schiller said, was born for that which is better. And we don't see a whole lot of that. And it's really crucial that we wage this fight. The education fight that has to be waged is one of the most important. And we have to free the term freedom from people who think freedom just means whatever excess you want.
Yeah, it's like the pursuit of happiness. I have a right. I have the right to pursue happiness. I claim it, but I don't claim the right to pursue happiness at the expense of other people, because an honest, real, spiritual person would not want to be happy at someone else's expense. And but at the same time, we all, from our Declaration of Independence and just a general sense of who we are as Americans, we feel like we have the right to seek, and that means to fulfill our inner selves, whatever it might be.
Well, but that's what the founders meant. They had a philosophical sense. Franklin took this concept from Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the great philosopher and scientist, as opposed to Bentham, who said the greatest happiness for the greatest people, the greatest pleasure for the greatest people. No, Leibniz basically said being creative is what brings happiness. Doing something that makes the world better, that increases the potential for mankind to be more creative. And that's what science is. That's what the arts are about. That's why we study history. But if you start getting rid of all of that and all you're interested in is how do I make enough money so I can shut the world out and have my pleasures, that's not the kind of happiness that Ben Franklin and Hamilton and Washington and the founding fathers meant.
No, and that's where this totalitarian state is leading us. It's leading us into isolation chambers where we will watch a video of something that we would like to
What's it
do
called now? Meta?
instead
The
of doing it.
metaverse?
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, Matt's right. That's all part of the psyop. I haven't studied it, and I don't want to get involved in this meta thing. It is. It's all part of the psyop, but I want to expand on that because what they've done through Disney is they've created children that are ready to accept the idea that there's all these different realities out there, and you really don't know. You don't know anything, and so it's a destruction of real culture. It's a destruction of history, and it's a destruction of families, and destruction of all the ways of life that we are used to. And I do trace this back to, as you do, to the British, and in particular the Fabian Society, which to
Yeah.
me has been driving this craziness that we're seeing right now. I mean, as it's been pointed out to me, Tony Blair is a Fabian, and anybody that doesn't understand what that means, well, you might vote Labor. But if you understand what it means, then you've got to stand up against it. This business of creating a sustainable. When you see that code word sustainable, that means that they're going to cut down the population. You know, that means that the population is going to be if they're going to let you live, as opposed to throwing you into the test tube to make some more drugs. If they're going to let you live at all, it's going to be because they know how to make money from you. And there he is, right in front of his window, with
Grinning.
smashing the earth on a anvil with a hammer, so that they can make it over in their own image. This is not a fake. This is not a myth. They are really, really trying to do this, Harley.
Well, and John, there are two competing versions of this, which actually come from the same, because on the one hand, you have the so-called liberal socialist model, which is supposedly equality and everyone shares everything, and that's what Blair talks about. But who does Blair really work for? He works for the wealthiest networks of the City of London. Now, on the other hand, you have people who say we should have no government and have a total Darwinian jungle where do whatever you have to do to be wealthy and happy. But who controls that narrative? That's the same network. So you have on both sides of the aisle in the Congress, the Labour versus the Tories in Britain, the whole world has this false dichotomy.
Exactly.
But what you have above it, perching over it like a giant spider, is the corporate cartels. And in the 20th century was the era when the corporate cartels saw that they could run the world. And they were involved in the Mussolini project, the Hitler project, the Soviet project. After World War II, largely because of the ingenuity of the American system and the emergence of a Hamiltonian impulse in Franklin Roosevelt, the United States demonstrated we could do something else. We could produce, we could raise the standard of living for everyone without taking away their property or taking away their freedom. But that was what was attacked by the rock, sex, drug counterculture, which said, oh no, this is destroying the earth. Klaus Schwab said it most clearly. He said it's the desire for a better life, which is what's destroying the planet. So therefore, we have to get rid of that desire. People who want a better life are the ones who are making the decisions that are destroying the planet, according to Schwab. And what they found out at the COP26 or the FLOP 26 is that much of the world doesn't accept their ideas. It was rejected by the Indians, by the Nigerians, the South Africans, the Russians, the Chinese, who some of them paid lip service to the idea, but none of them would accept this idea of getting rid of fossil fuels. Because if you get rid of fossil fuels in a poor country, what do you have left? Nothing. And fossil fuels are still relatively cheap and efficient. And the modern use of fossil fuels, it's not the same as it was in East Germany in the 1960s. You have clean coal, you have these different things. So, we've got a whole potential for a new era of American system productivity. And instead, we're being herded into this idea that we all have to give up basically everything for the sake of saving the planet, which probably doesn't need saving from us or by us. It needs saving from us.
If it weren't for the control of the media, they couldn't get away with this at all, because it doesn't make any sense to sensible people, and so they shut us down. My last question for you today, because I apologize, folks, but Harley has to leave at 11:40 East Coast time, and we've got 3 minutes then to toss this question at you. How does it feel to get a strike from YouTube? You guys are like the cleanest, the most conservative. You're like very, very cool. I don't understand. In my case, I've had numerous strikes, and I've lost entire channels. I lost over 900 videos on my first hit, and it's crazy. And it's like feeling like you're on a tightrope every time you want to broadcast. Should I go on YouTube or not? Well,
Yeah.
how does it feel now? You guys have got hit with it, and I think we all got to roll up our sleeves and go after this Federal Communication Commission and tell them,
Absolutely.
this is a
Absolutely. This is where we need antitrust legislation. Look, what happened to us is they shut down our capability to do live streaming for our conference on Saturday and Sunday, based on a ruling that a video we made on January 18th, 2021, violated community standards, saying that we advocated violence. Now, we never advocate violence.
No.
But of course, if you appeal it, it's never going to get heard before the weekend when you have the conference. The intent was to make sure our conference was restricted as far as the numbers of people who could have access to it. The good news is you can go to the schillerinstitute.com and see the whole conference. And it was an incredible conference of different people from all over the world coming together to debate the kinds of questions that you've raised with me today. How do we get out of this otherwise catastrophic situation where we're headed toward conflict and wars and depression? So I'd urge people to do that. And John, I'm with you on this fight against the YouTubes and the Googles and the others. I think the most important thing is find whatever channel you can, whatever means you can to reach people, and go like hell with real ideas and provoke debate.
Well, that's what you do. That's what I do. That's what an awful lot of good-hearted people do. And it's not about trying to make money on this. This is all about we are here to preserve, protect, and defend our Constitution, our way of life, and humanity itself. The changing of the genes is also something we need to talk about sometime. They don't stop, they keep on.
Well, and the people who control it,
yeah,
the people who control it are the ones who are making money.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right, we have to leave.
And I apologize to everyone that I have to leave, but every once in a while I have to put on my Papa cap and do something for the family.
All right. Well, the family comes first in my book too. And thank you so much, Harley. All the best to you. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Have a
See you
great
soon.
afternoon.